How many times can a woman hear she's worthless before a blood-soaked stranger walks out of the storm and changes everything? 7 men rejected Winnie Hale in that frontier barn, then chose her alone. Stay with this one, because by the end you'll understand exactly why the mountain behind Widow Creek carries her name today, and why nobody in that town ever laughed at her again. The cold that came down on Widow Creek in the last week of November was not the kind that simply made a person shiver. It had opinions about you, found the thin places in a coat, and reminded you it had been waiting in those mountains long before anyone built a town at their feet. Winnie Hale stood at the cracked mirror over the wash basin in the back room of her father's cabin and did what she could to look presentable for the gathering. Her dress was clean, boiled twice and pressed with a flat iron, but it was 2 years old, thinned at the elbows, the hem let out until the stitches showed. She was 24, and she had worked harder for longer than most women twice her age, with very little to show for it. Through the thin wall she could hear her father moving in the main room, the clink of a glass, a chair scraping back, the long pull of silence that followed a swallow. Emmett Hale had been a carpenter once, a good one, before the drink took the steadiness out of his hands and put it somewhere Winnie had never found. His voice came through the wall. "You about ready? Gathering starts at 7. She didn't answer. There was nothing worth saying. She could have pointed out she'd been ready for half an hour, or that she'd already heard 2 women at the dry goods counter wondering aloud whether anyone would offer for her this year, and that the wondering hadn't sounded hopeful. She picked up her coat instead, mended at the collar, missing a button, and put it on. The gathering happened every year in the big barn that belonged to Cyrus Lang, who owned the general store, the feed depot, and a fair portion of the paper on half the households in Widow Creek. On its space it was a harvest, social, music, cider. Neighbors catching up before the deep snow sealed the valley off from itself. In practice, everyone understood what it actually was. The territory was still young and hard enough that eligible women were scarce and winters killed men who faced them alone. So every November, the unmarried men and women of Widow Creek were put in front of each other while the town looked on and quietly kept score. Matches got made, arrangements got discussed. It was practical. The frontier had no patience left over for romance. Winnie had understood all of this since she was 17, watching her older sister Sarah get chosen by a wheat farmer from the valley floor and ride off to a solid house and a husband. She'd understood it every November since, standing against a barn wall while other women got chosen, and she wore a smile that never reached her eyes. This was her 7th gathering. She had never once been picked. The barn was already full when she and her father arrived, lanterns swaying from the rafters, a fiddle working through something bright in the corner, the smell of wood smoke and mulled cider pressing close in the warm, crowded dark. Her father peeled off toward the cider barrel the moment they were through the door. Winnie watched him go without expression, then made her way to the wall. Winnie Hale. Louisa Pratt, who ran the seamstress shop, stood with 2 other women in their good dresses, watching her with expressions that were almost kind. Almost. "You look well," Louisa managed, in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. "Cold night for it. It's always a cold night." For it, Winnie excused herself before the little glance the women traded could finish landing. The first hour passed easily enough for everyone but her. Jenny Sutter laughed with the new blacksmith. The Farrow sisters held court in the center of the room. Even Martha Combs, 42 and twice widowed, had found a rancher willing to talk crops with her. She drank her cider slowly, watched the fiddle player, and assured herself, without much conviction, that she didn't care. Owen Briggs was the first, a heavy-set wheat farmer with the look of a man doing something he'd already decided to do, regardless of how he felt about it. He opened with her father's card debts before he'd finished introducing himself, made plain he needed a wife who could bring something to a partnership, and put his hat back on and walked away. Jasper Colt, who worked a mining claim north of town, didn't make it through a full conversation before his face closed over like a door shutting. A stranger down from the Northern Territories talked soil and crop yields for 20 minutes before admitting he needed a woman who came with land. Amos Reed, who owned the sawmill, traded a few words with her father across the room and never came over at all. By then, Winnie had stopped counting exactly, though the number kept climbing, each rejection a small blade she filed away rather than let show. Cyrus Lang's son, Eli, 19 and spotty-faced, was the fifth or the sixth. She genuinely no longer knew which, and even he took one look and found urgent business elsewhere. Somewhere behind her, low and quickly smothered, someone laughed. That was the thing that finally cracked something loose in her chest. Not the rejections, she'd built calluses over those years ago, but the sound of someone finding entertainment in watching her be passed over again and again. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and walked deliberately toward the punch table, refusing to give anyone a show. She was nearly there when she heard two women behind her, speaking in the particular whisper of people who want to be heard without technically being caught at it. Can't imagine why she keeps coming. Everyone knows her father owes half the town money. Who'd take that on? And she's not unpleasant looking, but so severe. Never smiles, right? Sarah got out at the right time, didn't she, before the family went to ruin? Winnie poured her cider with a steady hand, stared at the wall, and reminded herself that every minute passing was 1 minute closer to leaving. That was when the barn doors blew open. Not opened, blew, slamming back against the wall with a crack like a rifle shot, and the cold came through them like something alive. Candles guttered. Women cried out. A few men reached for weapons they weren't carrying. In the doorway stood a shape Winnie's mind needed a full second to properly place, enormous coated head to boot in snow, as if he'd walked straight through the heart of the storm rather than bother seeking shelter from it, which was likely exactly what he'd done. Over one shoulder he carried a bundle of wolf pelts, silver, gray, and dark. In his other hand a cloth sack that struck the floor with a dense metallic sound. His face was half hidden under a battered hat brim and a beard grown well past intention. His coat was canvas and leather, patched in so many places the original material had become almost incidental. And on the shoulder of that coat, dark against the wet canvas, was a stain that wasn't dirt or melted snow. Old blood. Dried to rust, not fresh, but blood all the same. Winnie recognized him before most people in the room did, not because she knew him, but because everyone in Widow Creek had heard the stories. The mountain man who lived past the timberline, who came down twice a year to trade and never stayed a minute longer than trading required, Wade Calloway. 30, maybe 31, the mountains did something to a man's face that had nothing to do with counting years. His eyes were pale, gray-green, and they moved across the room with the slow, cataloging attention of someone who trusted nothing and missed less. Cyrus Lang found his voice spurred and came forward with the smile of a man with a ledger he wanted settled. "Wade, we weren't expecting you until spring. Got down ahead of the worst of it." His voice was lower than when he expected, unhurried, saying only what needed saying. 2 grays and 30 pounds of standard pelts plus this. He nudged the sack with his boot, and it clinked again, raw silver, off the north ridge. "About 10 pounds, he paused. "Don't need to say how I know what it is." The murmur that went through the crowd at the word silver was immediate and involuntary, the sound of people quietly recalculating. Wade had already stopped looking at Lang. His eyes moved across the eligible women gathered near the center of the room with the flat, uninterested attention of a man reading a list in a language he didn't much care for. Then his gaze reached Winnie and stopped there. She felt it as a physical thing, the weight of it, and she did not look away. Not tonight, not after everything the evening had already cost her. She looked back at him the way she might look at an unfamiliar dog in the road, watchful, not afraid, waiting to see what it would do. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile. More like recognition, the look of a man finding something unexpected in a familiar place. He picked up his sack of silver and crossed the room toward her, and the crowd parted around him the way water parts around a rock, without deciding to. He stopped 3 feet in front of her. Up close, the blood on his shoulder was unmistakable. "You're Emmett Hale's girl, Winnie Hale." He didn't offer a hand. "I know who you are. You live past the timberline, past where the trails end. I've heard. What have you heard?" She could have softened it. The evening had already beaten the politeness out of her. "That you're half wild and entirely unfriendly, that you come down twice a year, trade fast and leave faster." Something small moved at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, but the beginning of the idea of one. Mostly accurate. "What do you want, Mr. Calloway?" Around them, the whole barn had gone very quiet. The fiddle had stopped. Wade reached into his coat and set a small leather pouch on the table beside her. Another dense, metallic weight. Plain, without decoration. "I'm looking for a partner. For the winter, the cabin. I've run that territory alone 5 years. Winter's harder. I need someone who holds the cabin, while I work the lines. Who does what needs. Doing, without needing reminding. Twice, you need a hired hand. There are men in town. I'm not talking about a hired hand." Flat, impatient at being misunderstood. "I'm talking about a partner, someone with a stake in it, someone who stays." The word wife hung in the air unspoken, and Winnie felt the entire room lean in to hear what she'd say. She looked at this enormous, blood-stained, snow-covered, reportedly half-savage man who had walked past every prettier, younger, better-connected woman in the barn and come straight to her, who hadn't inquired after her father's debts or her prospects, who had looked at her like she was worth looking at. Why, me, it wasn't quite a question. He glanced at her hands, wrapped around the cider cup. Rough, scarred, marked from years of cutting wood and patching walls and doing everything her father hadn't. Your hands. Everyone works? Not like that. You don't look at it like something that happened to you. You look at it like something you decided. It was possibly the truest thing anyone had spoken about her in years, and it had come from a stranger, at the worst moment of her calendar, in front of the whole town. The mountain's dangerous. People die up there. Experienced people. I don't know the first thing about trap lines. I'll teach you. And if I can't learn fast enough—" Something moved in his eyes, not dismissal, not reassurance, just honesty. "Then you'll have a very hard winter. But you'll have a hard winter either way." She looked around the barn, at the polite, averted eyes, at the careful smiles that held pity behind them, at her father, on his third cider, pretending not to watch. She looked back at Wade, half. He blinked, the first time she'd seen him do it. "What? Half of whatever the territory produces. Pelts, silver, all of it. I'm not going up there as labor. If I'm a partner, I want a partner's share." The barn made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Wade looked at her for a long moment, working something out behind his eyes. 35. Another pause. Longer. "Half," he agreed, and something in his face settled that looked almost like respect. She set down her cup, picked up the pouch, heavier than she expected, and put it in her coat pocket. "When do we leave morning? Before light?" She nodded and did not look for her father and did not let herself feel anything except the cold weight of silver in her pocket and the knowledge that she was making a decision she couldn't take back. "I'll be ready." If a story like Winnie's is the kind that keeps you coming back to this channel, consider becoming a channel member. Tap the join button beside the channel name. It helps keep these stories coming. She spent that night packing what little was worth taking: a change of clothes, her mother's bone-handled knife, a photograph of Sarah laughing the summer before her wedding, a wool blanket still good. Her father found her near midnight, holding a lamp, looking older than his years in its light. "You're going, then?" "Yes." "With Calloway, Winnie, don't tell me it isn't safe, not unkindly." "What isn't safe is another winter in this cabin, with the roof getting worse and your tab at the saloon getting longer. And don't tell me you're worried about me, Papa, because if you were, you'd have done something about it before tonight." His face crumpled, the way a damaged structure settles under its own weight. "He's not a safe man, I know." She closed her pack. "I've never actually been safe." She was waiting outside at 4:30 when Wade came down the road with 2 horses and a loaded pack mule, moving through the dark like a shadow that had learned to navigate it. He gave her a single nod that might have meant good, or on time, or this is your last chance to change your mind. And she didn't ask which. She took the reins of the gray gelding and hauled herself into the saddle. "How long's the ride?" 4 days, if the weather holds." She looked north at the sky gone gray-black with cloud, the peaks invisible. "It won't hold." "No," he agreed. "It won't." He turned his horse north, and Widow Creek fell away behind them in the dark, and she didn't look back, not because she wasn't afraid, but because looking back felt like spending something. The first days climbed through stands of pine that grew taller and heavier with snow the higher the trail went, and Winnie found the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. The silence of 2 people doing the same hard work. At a frozen stream, she nodded at the stain on his coat. "Wolf 3 weeks back, pack of 4 on the east line. I killed 2, the other 2 ran flat, stripped of drama. You'll need to teach me to shoot. I can use a rifle." "I'm not good with one, I'll teach you," same tone as the barn, a fact about the future rather than a promise. They made camp that first night in a hollow where a stand of spruce broke the wind, and Wade built a fire with an efficiency that was almost unnerving to watch. No wasted motion, every step exactly in its place. Over salt pork and beans, he laid out the rules of the mountain in a voice that expected no argument. only memory. Never go past the East Ridge alone until she knew the land. The drop hid under snow until it didn't. Never open the cabin door in a whiteout without tying off first. Watch the horses. If they both stopped eating, something was coming. Don't try to manage the mountain. Work with it, even when it cost time or felt wrong. Rules about you. I don't make small talk. I'll tell you what you need to know when you need to know it. If you're doing something wrong, I'll say so. That's fair. I've heard I'm severe. The almost smile came back. Severe means you don't pretend. That's useful up there. The second and third days climbed into country that had shed any pretense of hospitality. Trees thinning, then gone. On the fourth afternoon, coming over a ridge she'd thought was the last one, and finding another behind it, Wade pointed. There. She looked up to see the cabin sitting in a hollow against a sheltering rock face, its woodshed full to the roofline, a rope line running to a small outbuilding for whiteout guidance. It was not beautiful. It was solid and real, and Winnie, who'd watched the walls of a collapsing cabin lean inward for years, recognized those as the most valuable things anyone had ever given her. It's good. Most people say it looks like a prison. Most people don't know what they're looking at. His shoulders shifted just slightly, like something held too tight had briefly let go. The second room was hers, a little gruff about it, standing in the doorway as though he hadn't fully decided to come all the way in. I added a bunk before I came down should hold. Thank you. He nodded, came inside, closed the door, and the wind pressed against the walls with serious intent, and the logs held. Show me the stove, and then show me how this thing works, because I have a feeling if I do it wrong, I'll burn the whole place down. The not-quite smile came back further along this time. It sticks in cold weather. I'll show you. That was how it started, not with speeches, but with a stubborn flue and a cook stove, and two people learning what they'd each agreed to. The flue stuck for 3 mornings running before she got it on the first try, and something in her chest settled like a debt reduced by a small payment. That was how the mountain worked. She was learning. It gave nothing freely, only in small increments, bought with attention and the willingness to be wrong before being right. Wade was gone most mornings before she woke, working the near lines while the light was still thin and blue, and back by mid-morning, sometimes with something, sometimes without. He stood at the window a few minutes each time before speaking, decompressing from the mountain's total solitude back into the fact of another person in his space. And she learned not to talk at him during those minutes, not unfriendliness. The teaching never let up. He showed her how to skin and dress a rabbit in 15 minutes. She took 40. The first time, 30 the second, 20 the third, and he volunteered nothing about any of it except, eventually you learn fast, which she was coming to understand was extravagant praise coming from him. He showed her the difference between hours-old tracks and minutes-old ones, crouched in the snow pointing at compression and crystal formation, and one morning she correctly read a fox track crossing a deer trail from the evening before. "You're not bad at reading sign," he allowed in a tone that made clear he'd expected her to need far longer. The rifle was harder. Her instinct was to anticipate the shot, flinching before the trigger broke, pulling the barrel low. Wade stood behind her while she missed a propped plank 4 times. Flatly, "Stop trying to make it happen. That's not very practical advice. It's the only advice there is. The shot has to surprise you." You set everything right, stance, breath, sight, and then you let it happen instead of forcing it. She drew a breath the way he'd shown her, in, half out, held, and the rifle went off and the plank jumped. She clipped to the edge. The next day she hit the center, and he nodded once and walked back toward the cabin. And she stood in the snow feeling something too tired and complicated to call satisfaction, but close kin to it. The cold deepened as November folded into December, and Winnie discovered that everything she'd thought she knew about winters had been a rehearsal for the real thing above the timberline. Ice formed 2 inches thick inside the water barrel some mornings, broken with an axe handle before either of them could use it. She started rising earlier than Wade to have the fire built and the water broken before he came through, not because he'd asked, but because it made her feel like part of the engine rather than a passenger. You don't have to do that. I know I don't. The next morning, she found a week's firewood stacked by the door, so she wouldn't have to go out in the dark for it, neither mentioned it. That was how they voiced the things too hard to say outright, not with words, but small adjustments that meant I noticed, and I'm accounting for you. One evening in early December, working leather at the table while she sharpened the good knife, Wade didn't look up. My brother built half this cabin. Winnie held the whetstone still, having learned by then not to react too quickly. His name was Daniel, 2 years younger. He'd be 27 now. What happened? Her voice stayed even. Wade set the leather down and looked at the dark pressing the window. Land dispute. Man named Otis Vane down in Larkspur Valley. Wanted the North Ridge, tried to buy it 3 years running. Daniel wouldn't sell, so Vane found another way. Friends in the territory office. A claim backdated. Daniel went down to fight it legally. Never came back. The official word was an accident. Ice on the road, horse went down. I've never believed it, and I've never been able to prove it either. Going down there with a rifle, instead of evidence, just gets me hung and hands him the ridge besides. So, I stay up here. I hold it. I wait for him to make a move. I can answer. I'm sorry about your brother. She didn't dress it up. It didn't need dressing. He nodded once, picked the harness back up, and the wind pushed at the walls and the fire held against it, and something in the cabin's air shifted after that night, the way air shifts once a pressure front has passed through. She began noticing things she'd filed away as merely practical, the way he always put himself between her and a door outside, the way he checked her horse's harness every morning without making a show of it, the way her plate carried a little more than seemed quite right, consistent and deliberate. The mountain she was learning had its own language, and one of its central words seemed to be, let people show you things without making them explain it. She got her first rabbit alone in mid-December, a snare set in a spot Wade had approved but not chosen. The run under a deadfall near the woodshed draw. She skinned it in 17 minutes and felt a pride she wasn't going to apologize for. She explained her reasoning. He only nodded. Put 2 there next time. Both were full the following morning. There were hard days, too. Cold so complete that crossing to the woodshed felt like swimming against a current. Days when the isolation sat in the room with her, like an object she had to work around. She missed the ordinary noise of people without missing the life she'd actually lived. She didn't say this to Wade, but she suspected he understood it without her needing to explain, the way he understood most things without ever putting them into words. 2 days before Christmas, neither one marked. A storm came down from the north unlike anything they'd had before, not louder or colder exactly, but heavier with intent, as though it had traveled a long way and meant to finish what it started. It locked them inside together for 2 full days, the first extended stretch either of them had spent unable to step out Wade, that 6 weeks of daily proximity had only hinted at. He had nightmares. She heard one through the wall. A short sound cut off fast, the sound of a man who taught himself to stop it before it went further. He drank coffee constantly and had read everything on the shelves at least twice. On the storm's second afternoon, she finally put the question that had been sitting with her for a while. At the gathering, he walked past every one of them. The Farrell sisters were right there. He didn't look up from the harness peg he was whittling. I know, younger, better connected, so why me? Your hands the way you stood. Everyone else in that room was performing something, prettiness or availability. You were just there. Done pretending. She looked at her hands, at the calluses layered over older ones. I was having a terrible night. I could see that too. You weren't hiding it well, but you weren't falling apart either. You were just staying in it. He worked the wood a while longer. That's rarer than pretty. She didn't answer that for a long time, turning it over like a stone she wasn't sure was valuable or just a stone. She thought about her father in the doorway, saying, "He's not a safe man," which was true. She thought about what safety had actually looked like in that collapsing cabin, years of careful management and invisible labor and annual humiliation, and wondered whether she'd confused safety with familiarity for most of her life. The mountain, brutal and specific and utterly indifferent to her comfort, was giving her something the valley never had. It was making her real, someone whose existence carried visible weight. The storm broke on Christmas morning, though neither marked it as such, and Winnie woke to an open silence. Sky cleared hard blue, drifts sculpted 6 feet deep against the woodshed's north base. Wade was already gone. By 2 in the afternoon, he still hadn't returned, and she remembered, with a jolt, that weeks before. He'd made clear he was never out past midday in winter unless he'd warned her beforehand. By 3, she'd made the decision before she consciously finished thinking it. Dressed for the worst of it, checked the rifle, took extra cartridges, lit the lantern, tied off to the rope line, then let go and walked north. She knew the east trap line. She'd walked it with him 4 times, alone, twice. She crossed the frozen creek and followed the line north along the upper slope, and after 10 minutes she found his tracks, deep and even, and then the change. The stride shortened, 1 print deeper on the right than the left. Then another. No, the word came out loud to nobody, and she moved faster. She found him 2/3 of the way down the draw, on his side in the snow, half pulled under a rock shelf, some instinct still working. His coat was torn at the shoulder in the jagged way of teeth, not a blade. She was on her knees beside him before she'd finished registering any of it. Wade. His skin was deeply cold, but not the cold of a man already gone, the cold of a man who'd been lying in snow too long and was still fighting it. His eyes opened slowly, glassy, and found her face. His voice came out rough. "Storm's coming again. You need to stop talking, Winnie. Stop." She was already assessing with her hands. The shoulder was the worst of it, deep through coat and layers. A lesser wound above his right knee. He was conscious, but only approximately. She looked at the draw, the slope, the distance back, the sky already turning the specific purple-gray she'd learned to read as warning. 20 feet off, the remains of a small freight sled lay half buried, one runner broken, but the platform sound. She dragged it back, arms screaming. "This is going to hurt." I know, which meant he was tracking well enough to understand. The best news she'd had in 20 minutes. Getting him onto the sled cost her everything she had and some things she didn't know she'd had. She looped rope across his chest so he wouldn't slide, put the rope over her own shoulder, and leaned into it the way she'd seen a workhorse lean into a heavy load, her whole body against the resistance instead of her arms alone. The sled moved 6 inches, then a foot. She didn't think about the distance. She'd learned that much from the mountain already. You don't think about how far the end is. You think about the next step, and then the one after. The wolf found them on the upper slope, one animal moving through the snow with the soft, purposeful sound that was worse than any howl. She stopped, set the lantern down, unslung the rope, and though her hands were not steady, she catalogued that fact without shame and brought the rifle up anyway. She drew breath the way he'd taught her, in, half out, held, and did not try to make it happen, and the rifle went off and the wolf dropped in the snow and didn't move again. She listened for more, heard only the wind picking back up from the north, and pulled. Afterward, she couldn't have reconstructed how long it took or how many times she stopped. Her memory of it came in disconnected pieces, lantern light on snow, the rope burning through her coat at the shoulder, Wade's breathing which she checked at every halt to confirm it was still happening, the moment her hands stopped feeling like her own, and she had to look at them to confirm they were still holding the rope. She nearly walked past the rope line in the dark, and only the pale ridge of accumulated snow along it, caught at the lantern's edge, stopped her. She followed it to the outbuilding, then the cabin door, and got the bar up somehow, and got him inside. She couldn't lift him off the sled. Her arms had nothing left for lifting. So she piled blankets on the floor and cut the rope across his chest because her fingers wouldn't manage the knot, and rolled him onto the blankets ungently and got the fire roaring. The pain of her hands coming back to feeling was one of the worst physical things she'd ever experienced, as though she were being taken apart and reassembled with the pieces slightly wrong. She clenched and unclenched her fists, forced her way through it, and kept working. She'd watched Wade clean and treat 2 wounds in the week she'd been there, watching carefully because she'd understood this knowledge was never academic up here. She poured carbolic over cloth, threaded a needle, and knelt beside him. "This is going to be worse than the sled. I know. You can tell me if I do something wrong. I will. Pull the edges together before you stitch. I've sewn worse in coat leather." She poured the carbolic. He made a sound and locked his jaw against making another. She worked fast, but not careless. No training for elegant, but tight even, closed. It held. She worked over an hour, and when she finished, her back ached and her hands shook again, not from cold this time, but from the particular hollowness of concentrating hard on something that mattered without stopping. Wade turned his head, eyes clear now and fully tracking, despite the gray of blood loss in his face. "You came out in that. Not a question. You didn't come back." He was quiet a moment, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not gratitude exactly, which would have been too clean, but something more complicated, with confusion in it. "That was an order to leave me. I know. I meant it. I know." She pushed herself up, legs objecting the whole way. I ignored it. He healed slowly, which frustrated him more than he tried very hard to conceal. The fever came the second night, and broke on the third morning. She knew before checking because the quality of silence from his room changed from a man fighting something to a man simply sleeping. He was sitting up by the fourth day too soon and made that plain. The near line needs checking. I checked it yesterday. 2 rabbits and a fox, in the shed. He went to the east. Draw the near line. I know the difference. He looked at her a long moment. Drink your coffee, Wade. She turned back to the stove, and behind her she heard something that was very possibly the quietest laugh a man had ever produced. He was on his feet the day after that, still too soon but negotiable. Once she pointed out she'd be stitching that leg a second time if he tore it open again. The forced proximity of his recovery gave them a kind of honesty neither had room for before. He opened up more about Daniel, not the facts but the texture of him, the brother who could talk to people and charm his way through the territory's social machinery in a way Wade never had patience for, and how losing him had collapsed, not just the grief, but the working shape of the whole operation. He'd have liked you. He liked people who never hid what they thought. Most people don't actually like that. He wasn't most people. Tell me about Vane. Winnie, let the evening sit a moment. Wade set the leather down and looked at the fire a long moment. Otis Vane is 58, built his operation in Larkspur Valley 30 years, freight company, 2 ranches, the timber contract for the rail line coming in 3 years. The silver would be worth a great deal to a man who already controls the freight to move it. It was never just land. His jaw tightened. He buys what he can and eliminates what he can't, and keeps his hands clean while other men do the eliminating. 2 hired guns, permanent, not ranch hands. He'll hear about the wolf. Word travels. And when it reaches him, he'll see a window. The silence had a different weight than his usual silences. How long since he's made a move? 2 years, small things, a rider I didn't recognize on the South Trail. He's been waiting for me to be weak. Well, something almost wry crossed her voice. Now he thinks you are. 2 weeks into January, checking snares south along the tree line, she found tracks. 3 sets of horses, recent, moving north along the tree line in a line that wasn't hunting and wasn't trapping. She fixed every detail in her memory, hoof size, spacing, the slight asymmetry in one horse's gait, and went back and laid it out for Wade in exactly the order she'd found it. When she finished, south approach. They're learning the trail to the cabin. How many ways up? The main trail. The West Ridge route, though it's nearly impassable in this snow, experienced men only. The east, draw. The north face is impassable in winter. Full stop. That's 3. Then he nodded, already shifting from grief to tactics, which was exactly the shift she needed from him. She spread his hand-drawn map on the table, and for 2 hours they went through it, point by point. The next day she started setting traps, not snares, deadfalls, the heavy log arrangements Wade had shown her weeks earlier for managing predators, triggered by a pressure plate that would drop real weight on whatever set it off. She worked the narrowest section of the South Trail for 3 days while he was still limited, adjusting each night on his corrections. She undermined a section of the East Draw where the trail ran beneath 2 unstable snow shelves, not destroying it, which would be obvious, but clearing the anchoring brush below, so real weight would bring it down. The West Ridge route, she brought it up on the 4th evening. You marked it nearly impassable in winter. Nearly. If they send someone experienced up it to flank while the main group comes south, they'll expect it clear. They won't expect anyone's already been up there. I set 3 deadfalls on the critical section and loosened the snow on the upper ledge and packed it back over the trail. It looks solid. It isn't. He was quiet a long moment. When did you do that? Yesterday. Left at 4, back by noon. 5 hours alone. I know the section. I was careful. You should have warned me before you went. You'd have tried to come with me. You're not ready for that terrain yet. A long pause. No, something in it sounded confirmed rather than decided. You're not reckless. They came on a Tuesday. She heard the disturbance in the birds along the tree line before she heard the horses. 4 riders, 1 pack animal loaded heavy, they planned to stay. Wade's voice came low from the window. That's Vane. Medium height, compact, a good coat, a hat too clean for frontier weather, sitting his horse like a man reviewing a property he'd already decided to acquire. He brought 3 men, with the pack horse. He means to move things out today. He thinks this is already done. His face went still in the particular way she'd learned to be wary of. Wait, they don't know what I've done to the approaches. If they come straight up the south trail, the first deadfall triggers before they can see the clearing. Let them come to us. How confident are you in the trigger? Not are you sure, the right question instead. Very. I tested the weight twice. He nodded. South window's mine. You take the door. Your shoulder, window's mine. The flatness of it ended the conversation. The riders came up the south trail single file, and Winnie watched from behind the door, left open 3 inches on its latch, and waited. The lead man reached the switchback, and the crack of the trigger mechanism came clear even from this distance, followed by the heavy crash of 300 pounds of log dropping onto the trail. The lead horse reared, screaming, throwing its rider into the snow. The 2 behind it scattered backward in the instinctive panic of prey animals meeting falling weight. Vane's horse held, though it danced sideways, both his hands on the reins. Now Wade put his rifle through the window, and Winnie opened the door. She didn't shoot at the men, she shot at the snow shelf above the switchback, the one she'd loaded with weeks of accumulated weight, needing only a nearby impact to start it moving. The shelf let go in a slow, heavy exhalation, sliding down across the trail below the switchback and sealing it as completely as a closed gate. 1 man on foot fired a panic shot toward the cabin that went high and wide. Wade fired back from the window, and the man's hat came off and he threw himself behind a tree. Vane. A silence, then the man's voice came up through the cold air. For Stephen Wade, heard you'd had some trouble, came to discuss the property question. You're here because you thought I was hurt enough to take a pause. I'm not one of Vane's permanent men started shifting east toward the draw. The east draw isn't a better option. Winnie's voice carried clear and flat from the door. He stopped, looked back at Vane. Who is that? Something cracked loose from Vane's careful administration. My partner. Wade let the words sit in the cold air. There's nothing to discuss. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. You've got 1 passable trail out, and it goes south, and it's only open because I left it open. That changes if you're not moving in 5 minutes. There's 3 of us. I know. I set the deadfall for 4. A long silence. She watched the man beside Vane murmur something too quiet to hear, watched Vane sit his horse a moment longer calculating before he turned it south, and the three of them went back down the trail around the slide the way they'd come, and the sound of horses faded. She held her position 10 more minutes before stepping out from behind the door and letting go a breath that had been stored in her chest for the better part of 2 hours. Wade came from the window, moving carefully, the shoulder clearly having cost him something. He'll come back with more men and a better plan. I know, but not today, not today. The fire had burned low while they'd stood watch, and Winnie fed it and felt the warmth spread back through the room. Behind her, Wade sat down heavily at the table. Daniel would have been good at this, the planning. Tell me about the silver deposits. The North Ridge, I need to know exactly what we're holding, and exactly what Vane knows it's worth. A pause, and then, with the particular quality of a man deciding to stop carrying something alone. Sit down. I'll tell you everything. Vane came back 18 days later. She'd known he would, and Wade had agreed. And they'd spent those days working, planning, and sleeping badly. The evening planning sessions had become their most honest conversations, the place where neither had energy left to be careful about what got revealed. Wade's blind spot was Vane himself. 6 years of carrying his brother's death had made his judgment about the man too hot where it needed to run cold, and Winnie found herself pulling him back each time he framed their next move around. On the third planning night, he won't come with 3 men again. He thought it was already over. In winter, he could call 10 a survey crew, and no one down in the valley would blink. They'll come in sections or on foot from the tree line. He needs to reach the ridge, plant a man there, take samples, file paperwork before we can contest it. He doesn't need us gone right away. He just needs us contested. You've been thinking about what he actually needs. I've been thinking about what he deserves. Those aren't the same problem. We don't have to beat him in a fight. We have to make the ridge unreachable long enough for spring, so we can reach the territory office first, with everything written down. Daniel went down there alone. We go together. He was quiet a long time. Deputy Registrar, Samuel Whitfield. His father had nothing to gain from what Vane did and wrote Daniel about the irregularities before any of this happened. First, we survive winter. Then we find out. Wade's shoulder came back slowly over those 18 days, not to full strength, but to functional, enough to carry weight, work the lines, move rough terrain without careful management. On the 10th day, he walked the full perimeter of her defensive work and assessed it with the eyes of a man who knew the terrain better than anyone alive, and moved one deadfall 20 feet to a compression point where the ridge narrowed. She went up the next morning and moved it. He'd been right. Vane came on a gray morning with the sky, the color of dirty wool, and the pressure dropping in a way that meant serious weather building from the northwest. Winnie registered the drop when she woke and mentioned it to Wade, who noticed it first and was already at the window with his coffee, watching clouds stack above the north ridge. Today, she didn't ask how he knew. They came up the south trail at 9 in the morning, and this time there were 8 of them, 6 riders and 2 men on foot already, carrying equipment she recognized at distance as survey tools. Vane had brought his documentation crew. He meant to reach the ridge today no matter what happened at the cabin. He split his priorities. The surveymen are the real objective, the riders are cover. If the surveymen reach the ridge, they won't. A flatness had grown in her sometime after November Not bravado, which was noise, but the quiet voice of someone who'd already done the geometry and trusted the result. The riders hit the reinforced deadfall at 9:20, heavier log this time, tighter trigger, and it came down with a crack that threw 2 horses to the snow and the whole line into chaos, exactly as the tight trail was built to do. The 2 surveymen stopped below the switchback at the sound, looked at each other, then up toward the ridge, only 800 feet above them, and made the calculation she already knew the answer to. She was moving before they'd finished climbing. East exit. She pulled on her coat. "I'll get above them on the slope. Give me 20 minutes before you deal with the trail. 15. The weather's moving faster than you think." She went out at a run, or what passed for 1 and 2 feet of packed snow, took the cut through the east draw, and climbed rifle across her back, using her whole body against the angle the way she'd learned to use it against everything else up here. She heard the survey men below her before she saw them breathing hard, their equipment making the climb slow and awkward, and got above them into a rock outcrop 40 feet below the ridge proper, one carrying a transit instrument, the other a sample case and documentation paper. She braced against the rock and put a shot into the snow slope 4 feet left of the lead man. The sound was enormous in the open terrain. He lurched into his partner, and both went down, the transit instrument sliding 10 feet before catching on a rock. Her voice cut down the slope. "Leave it, the equipment and the samples. Go back down." The lead man scrambled up, furious, searching the slope for her. She fired again, closer, and he went back down. "I will not miss a 3rd time." A silence, and the lead man looked up at the ridge. Everything Vane had sent him for, did the math on distance and angle and the rifle above him, and found it didn't favor him. He left the transit. His partner left the sample case and the papers. They went back down the slope faster than they'd come up. Below, on the south trail, the fighting went on, a rifle crack, then the sound of horses moving away downhill. The wind was coming in hard from the northwest now, the pressure finally materializing into something real. The first hard pellets of snow driven sideways ahead of a storm she guessed was 20 minutes behind. She descended carefully, the surface turning treacherous under the new snow, and reached the cabin through smoke and warmth to find Wade at the table, a cut on his forearm. He'd ask about later, sitting very still with both hands flat on the wood and his eyes on the door waiting. Survey men are off the slope. They left their equipment. Trail's clear. Vane's men went south. Vane, too. How many of his people did you? Nobody's dead. I made sure of it. That matters when we go to the territory office. He was only echoing her own words from 2 weeks earlier, holding on to them even in the middle of something that must have cost him everything he had. It's not over. Not bleak, just accurate. "No," he agreed, "but today is." Spring came the way it always comes to that country, not gently, in a single arrival, but in arguments. Warm days that convinced you and cold nights that corrected you, the snowpack softening and refreezing until the balance finally tipped and the melt turned permanent, and the south-facing slopes. Winnie stood outside the cabin on the first morning that felt genuinely warm and looked for the woman she'd been in November, somewhere in what she felt now, and couldn't find her, not gone exactly, but built into something larger the way a stone gets built into a wall. Still itself, just part of the wall now. They left for Widow Creek on a Tuesday in late March, which she registered without comment. The night before, going through the documentation they'd assembled, Wade looked up without preamble. The half share, I want it formalized before we go down in writing. With a witness. We discussed this, and I want the cabin on the document too. Not just the territory's production, the property. Wade, you dragged me through a blizzard on a broken sled. Flat, factual, the tone he used for things already decided. You built defenses that held twice. You've worked this territory 5 months, and you know it as well as I do. The half was always the right number. She didn't argue. She'd learned when he'd decided something. Arguing was a waste of both their time. Widow Creek received them the way towns receive things they don't quite know how to categorize. Ward had come down through the winter, in fragments. The mountain man had been hurt. Someone was up there with him. Vane's survey team had come back without equipment and a particular silence about what had happened on the ridge. The complete picture was Winnie Hale riding in beside Wade Calloway with silver samples in the saddlebags and documentation in his coat, and an expression several people would later describe as difficult to name, not arrogance, not triumph, something quieter than either. Her father stood outside the dry goods store, and when she dismounted and he looked at her hands, her face, the coat mended twice more since November, something in him crumpled the way it had once before, in a doorway with a lamp. Winnie. Papa? Are you all right? I heard some things about the winter. I imagine you did. I kept expecting someone to come down off that mountain with bad news. I know. I'm here, Papa. That's the news. He put his arms around her, awkward and unpracticed, the embrace of a man remembering how, and she stood in it a moment and let him, because he was flawed past the point of most kinds of repair, and none of it changed the fact that he was her father. At the Territory Registrar's office, a flat-faced man named Pruitt informed them the elder Whitfield had retired, his post taken by his son. Samuel Whitfield was near 30, with his father's precision and a visible anger about things done wrong during his father's tenure. He went through their documentation 3 times, and on the 3rd pass he stopped, the backdated claim. The one Vane filed on your family's homestead 6 years ago, my father flagged irregularities and was persuaded to set them aside. I wasn't persuaded. I was 16. I read his private notes, and I've been waiting for someone with standing to bring this to a proper hearing. The hearing took 4 days. Vane arrived on the 2nd with his own lawyers and his own documents, and Winnie sat through the procedural machinery of it with the patience of a woman who'd survived 5 months of things considerably more demanding than paperwork. She testified once, plainly, in the voice she'd been using since November, I know what I saw and what I did, and I'm not asking you to like it. And Vane watched her from across the room with the look of a man trying to reconcile what he'd heard about the ridge with the person actually sitting in front of him. The two didn't match. She met his eyes without hostility and without performance. The flat acknowledgement of someone who had already won and was being generous enough not to say so. The original Calloway Homestead claim, the North Ridge, its deposits, all of it was confirmed. Vane's backdated filing was ruled fraudulent. The matter of Daniel Calloway's death was referred to a federal marshal for separate investigation, an addition Samuel Whitfield had made on his own, which left Wade very still in a way she'd come to understand meant he was feeling something he didn't yet have a name for. Vane left Widow Creek the following morning, gone south, not intending to return, and Winnie felt the quiet, specific sense of something unresolved for a long time, finally resolving. They stayed in Widow Creek 10 days, long enough to file the partnership documentation Wade had wanted in writing. arrange a formal assay of the Northridge deposits with a surveyor who worked for no one named Vane. Cyrus Lang came to speak with Winnie on the third day, hat in his hands, his dignity finding the moment expensive, saying the mill he'd been trying to sell for 2 years might be worth discussing. She looked at the lowered eyes, the careful arrangement of a man remembering exactly what he'd once thought of her in November. Come by Thursday, bring the mill's account. Thank you, Miss Hale. Mrs. Calloway? Not a correction so much as a statement of the current fact. She stood afterward on the main street in the spring sun and measured the distance between the woman she'd been in this town in November and the woman standing here now, and found she couldn't put it in any unit she knew. Wade came to stand beside her, not behind her, beside her, exactly where he'd been standing since December. Lang, I saw he'll negotiate hard. He doesn't have another buyer and he knows we know it, but he'll negotiate hard anyway, because he can't help himself. Let him. I might let you do some of it. You're frightening when you're quiet. I'm always quiet. He made the sound she recognized by then as the thing that wanted to be a laugh, and occasionally, briefly. Before this story finishes, if you believe it's worth remembering, become a channel member, tap the join button beside the channel name. Every membership helps keep stories like this one alive. The stories about them started that spring and kept changing shape as they traveled. By the time they reached the far settlements, the wolf had become a dozen, the storm the worst in 40 years. Vane's men had multiplied past all reason. Winnie heard some of the versions herself and found she didn't mind the distortion, because distortion was simply how significance traveled in a place with no other mechanism for carrying it. What stayed consistent across every telling, the one detail nobody's version ever dropped, was this. The woman had gone out into the blizzard alone to find him. Everything else was decoration. They built a life the way anyone builds a life worth having, imperfectly, with interruptions. 2 people each accustomed to doing things alone, learning slowly to do them together. A traveler passing through would ask a local about the name marked on the survey map for the ridge north of Widow Creek, and the story always started the same way. A woman stood in a barn one November, and 7 men looked her over and walked away, and then the mountain sent someone who looked at her differently. Winnie heard that version once from a traveler who had no idea who she was, and let it pass uncorrected. Not because she agreed with the framing. The mountain hadn't sent Wade. He'd walked in on his own, with silver and wolf pelts, and the loneliness of a man who'd carried something alone too long. But the part that mattered was in every version, being looked at differently. What happens when one person sees what everyone else missed? She thought about that sometimes, what it meant to be truly seen, not flattered or wanted in the surface way, but seen in the specific, inconvenient reality of herself. The scarred hands, the severe expression, the stubbornness, the things she'd survived that hadn't made her soft. She thought about the women in that barn with their careful smiles, her father saying, "He's not a safe man," the walk up the mountain in the dark, beside a stranger, afraid, deciding anyway. The decision had never really been about Wade. She understood now. It had been about herself. What she was willing to carry, willing to build, and finally refused to keep pretending was good enough. She'd walked into it with both eyes open, and it had demanded everything she had, and everything she had was enough. That wasn't rescue. That was something harder and more permanent and entirely hers. Wade found her one evening years later, Standing at the south window of the cabin they'd since expanded by a room, looking down at the valley where the lights of the far settlements made small gold points against the dark. Thinking about something, not a question, the barn. He came to stand beside her, and below them the valley lights met the stars. "Do you regret it?" Not worried. He'd stopped being worried about her answer somewhere in the second winter, wondering now only because that was simply who they were with each other. "No. I regret the years of pretending the cabin down there was enough, of going back to those gatherings. I don't regret a single day up here." He was quiet beside her, the silence that had become something like company, the presence of something larger than either of them, their smallness turned, somewhere along the way, into a kind of relief. The stitching on my shoulder. It held better than the professional work a surgeon in Denver did on my hand once years back. Thought you should know that. She looked at him a long moment, this man who had walked into a bride barn like weather itself, and turned out, in all the years since, to be significantly more complicated and more difficult and more worth knowing than any version of him she could have invented that first night. "Go make coffee." "I did." She stayed at the window a moment longer, looking at the lights and the stars, before turning into the warmth and the smell of coffee and the particular specific life she had built in the hardest place she had ever been. Below, in the valley, the town that had once watched her stand against a barn wall with its small, careful smiles would go on telling its stories. And above, on the ridge, the territory office had registered under the name Hale Ridge. Not because she'd been rescued there, not because the mountain had shown her any kindness, but because she had held it, and refused to let go. Winnie Hale had become exactly what she had always been. The only difference now was that the world no longer had a choice.